Hey peeps, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be going through some audio examples comparing GMaudio Clipper to Live's limiter, as well as showing you how to get the most out of GMaudio Clipper. I've got another video, which I'll link in the description, talking about the technical differences in how a clipper works compared to a limiter, as well as comparing GMaudio Clipper to other clippers on the market. But here we can focus on the audio examples and how the differences sound. I also have an article on my website discussing how and when to use a clipper, and there's also some information in the user manual of GMaudio Clipper. But for all these comparisons, we're going to use this project here, which is a melodic breakbeat idea I started, and shows the differences between clipping and limiting quite well. So I'll show you which sounds I used it on, and some tips for tweaking the controls on GMaudio Clipper. Let's start by listening to the project. So now you know how it sounds. Let's have a look at applying GMaudio Clipper to individual instruments, then groups, and then on the master. So before we get started, I'm just going to mute some of these effects. So now we have this. And I'll solo the kick, and I'll turn this off. So in the article on my website, I mentioned that the best way to determine whether or not you need a clipper or could benefit from clipping is by looking at the dynamic range of a track. If we look at this, we see the average volume in Live's track meter, which is the bright green meter, peaks at around -12, whereas the actual peak meter, the dark green level behind it, peaks at around -3. So that tells us we have 9 decibels of dynamic range. Now, a good rule of thumb when using a clipper is that any instrument that has more than 6 dB of dynamic range may benefit from some type of dynamics processing. And in doing that dynamics processing, the furthest we can probably take it is about half of that without changing the tonality of the sound too much. So I'm just going to add GMaudio Clipper 2.1 here, and we'll start tweaking the controls. We'll start by having a look at the meter, and we can see where the really short peaks are. Now, in the other video, I do have some diagrams that kind of show the difference between clipping and limiting, and how using a clipper well means that you're really only clipping a very short amount of the signal. And because it's such a short amount of time, that means that it is far less audible. So if we aim to just take off the really short peaks that we can see on the meter, and also take into account that maximum amount of dynamic range that we can reduce of about 4.5 dB, then we should be able to find a setting that allows us to reduce the overall peak volume of the sound, giving us more headroom, so space between the peak level and 0 dB, allowing us to turn that instrument up if we want to, but also add some edge to the start of the sound, allowing it to cut through the mix a little bit more, as well as the ability to set the level a bit easier amongst our other instruments. So with it playing, I'm just going to drag down the ceiling. And remembering that we can get around 4.5 dB of gain reduction before we start hearing an audible change. So let's go somewhere around there. Now, if I turn this off, back on, so it is changing the tone slightly. It's giving a little bit more knock to the front of the kick and adjusting that balance between bass and harmonics for the very start of the sound. That's going to be due to the shape of this sound, the volume over time. And if we back this off a little bit and perhaps adjust the knee, we can get a bit better compromise where it affects less of the tone. Or perhaps we like the sound of this extra knock at the start of the kick, because that'll help us make it cut through the mix. But let's make some adjustments. Yeah, that's much better. And we can even adjust the knee now in version 2.1. So that'll dig a little bit deeper into the sound with a slightly larger knee. With it off and with it on. Now, it almost sounds and feels louder now, even though we actually have less peak volume, which is a perfect example of why clipping is useful in a mix. Now, I'm going to turn this one off, and I'll switch between a clipper and a limiter on this particular track. So this is pretty much the same settings on GMaudio Clipper, and then if I switch to the limiter, so GMaudio Clipper actually sounds louder. They're doing pretty much the same amount of gain reduction. The peak level is exactly the same, but GMaudio Clipper feels and sounds louder, which is super useful with a kick drum, considering we're making electronic music, and the kick is really a fundamental instrument in our mix. So now I'm on the snare track, and the first thing I'm going to do is determine the dynamic range of this instrument by looking at Live's track meters. Here we can see that the RMS level is at around minus 18 decibels and the peak level minus 2. So we have 16 decibels of dynamic range there. So with GMaudio Clipper, we could potentially half that, which means 8 decibels. So I'll get a fresh instance of GMaudio Clipper, and let's have a look. So I'll start dragging down this ceiling, and we'll pull this down until we can kind of hear the changes being made. All right, we're at 8 dB of gain reduction now. If I turn this off, so at minus 10 dB for the ceiling, it makes a very small difference to the tone, and we've got an extra 8 decibels of headroom for a total of 10. So we can turn this sound up 10 dB if we wanted to get it louder in the mix to help it cut through. We could also solo the gain reduction if we wanted to hear what is actually being removed by GMaudio Clipper. So very short amount. We could even dial this back a bit if we wanted to make that sound a little bit shorter. And there's effectively no change to the tone. Now, if we compare this to Live's limiter, I'm just going to hit play and switch between the two. And then off. So there is a definite difference there. The limiter is reacting much slower, and it's taking away some of the punch of the snare. So when that first peak hits, it's applying all that gain reduction, but then the gain reduction isn't released fast enough to follow the contours of the sound, and is actually taking out some of the body of the sound, so it sounds weaker. So same peak volume, but a very different tone. All right, one more sound, and then we'll have a look at these sounds together. So here I am on the breakbeat. Let's listen to it in solo. Now we can see here that the RMS is around minus 30 and peak is at minus 12. So we've got over 20 dB of dynamic range. We can go up to about half that, so maybe 10 to 12 dB, and we'll see how it sounds. So again, very little change in tone, and we've got heaps of headroom. But let's perhaps back that off a little bit so that we've got even less change in tone. And maybe just take off these peaks so you can see all the variation here in level. Maybe if we just focus on the bits that are really spiky. So there is a bit of modulation on this sound, kind of changing it, but with a level there, there's very little tonal change to this sound. Yet we've got an extra 6 dB of headroom, of which we can turn the sound up louder. So now let's compare this to Live's limiter. Here it is with GMaudio Clipper. There it is with Live's limiter. I'll just switch this to left and right, so it's a similar operation to GMaudio Clipper. So it's kind of attenuating the highest frequencies more, which is generally what a limiter does. Because it has look ahead and is slower to react and smooths those volume changes over time, it quite often makes the sound a bit more dull. Whereas a clipper is the opposite. It's going to add a little bit more edge to the start of that sound. Now let's look at tweaking these parameters, listening to all of these happening at once. Now the best way to tweak any of these parameters with GMaudio Clipper is to have GMaudio Clipper the last device in your chain on a particular track, and to adjust the settings when you're listening to the full mix, so you can hear how the Clipper processing interacts with the other sounds. So we'll play it again, and we'll drag the ceiling down and try and find a spot where the kick cuts through the mix a bit better. So already starting to happen there. Kind of going away now. It's losing its edge, not cutting through the mix quite as well. So about there seems to sound quite good to me. And typically you do the same thing with the knee, but just make note, the knee is going to make less difference than the ceiling, but once you've got the ceiling dialed in, then you can adjust the knee to see what suits. Now you'll notice that these are all percussion sounds, and they have quite a bit of dynamic range, especially the snare and the break. But percussion isn't the only place that you can use GMaudio Clipper. If we go further into the track to where the bass starts to play, and we look at Live's track meters here, we can see that there is next to no dynamic range to this sound. The reason being is that sounds that are lower in frequency are slower to move. Therefore, the likelihood that they're going to be more dynamic is much less. So things with higher frequencies means faster movements in volume, which means it's much more likely to be more dynamic. So on a bass line like this, there's no real benefit to using clipping. Unless, of course, we wanted to change the tone with the clipper. But here I'm focusing on getting the most out of GMaudio Clipper to improve your mixes. So let's look at another sound. So here I have a plucky ARP. If I turn these effects off and load up a fresh instance of GMaudio Clipper, and we make some adjustments. So we can use it to just catch kind of the really sparse extreme peaks. And we won't change the tone much at all. We dig a bit deeper. It'll add a little bit more pluckiness to the sound. And help it cut through the mix. Now, the other two sounds in this project are a shaker and some chords. On the shaker, there is a lot of dynamic range and a lot of movement. And I'm doing it just to take off some of those peaks. And if I switch between that and Live's limiter, again, I'll make this left and right. So again, it makes the sound just that little bit duller. And in this track, I really like the edge to contrast the kind of softness of the track. Now over on these chords, they're actually sent to a return track. So if I just solo these and send them to the master, this particular sound, I didn't really want to have the edge. I want it to be softer, so I used a limiter. And then it's only going to return tracks to get softer again with all the reverbs and delays and such. So we've had a look at applying GMaudio Clipper to individual instruments and then making adjustments, listening to more of the mix so we can hear those changes in context. Now we can focus on a group or bus. So I'm just going to get a fresh instance of GMaudio Clipper. And again, you'll notice that this is towards the end of the device chain. So I do have some other processing here, some compression. I have a reverb, which I am actually attenuating based on transients using trans D. So it's creating a kind of a vacuum effect. Then some EQ, saturation with VSEQ, and some more compression using the upcoming Pentacomp. So with this fresh instance, let's pull down the ceiling and see how it affects the tone. And we can see on the meters that we could very easily take off these peaks without affecting the sound whatsoever, really. And as we go a little bit deeper, we're digging into more of the body of the sounds, but still can't hear any audible change. Or at least very little. It's kind of just adding some bite to those sounds, which in this particular scenario is my preference and what I wanted to achieve. So it's a perfect example of when you might use GMaudio Clipper. But let's go a little bit further. Still very subtle difference. So that's a lot of gain reduction now, and we can kind of hear some distortion happening on the kick and snare. It's definitely crunching up the sound a little bit. So with it off, we can see that the RMS level was around -18 and the peak level around -6. So we have roughly 12 dB of dynamic range. Therefore, the furthest we can probably take it would be 6 decibels of gain reduction. So let's try that. And with it off, with it back on. So that allows us to make our drums 6 dB louder, which is huge. Now we should really be making these changes listening to the whole mix, because no one is ever listening to your music with something soloed. So you should always try and make changes to individual tracks when you're listening to the entire mix. So I'll come out of solo and let's see how it sounds with that ceiling getting adjusted now. Sweet spot for me is definitely around here. I particularly like how the kick and bass is working with the rest of the track when I'm doing that amount of clipping on the group there. So now we're on the master track, and again, the clipper will be the last device in the chain. And just like on a group or bus, you should probably do a little bit less clipping, or it might be harder to get away with that extra bit of clipping. On a master bus, it's even harder to get away with lots of gain reduction with the clipper. If I add a fresh instance of GMaudio Clipper, and let's have a listen. So we can see that there's some sparse peaks that it's already catching. That doesn't really change the tone whatsoever, but we can probably come down a little bit more. If we go too far, we start to hear more distortion happening on the sound. Gets a bit dirtier. So if we go back to the soloing of gain reduction, we really only want to hear really short bits of sound. If we start digging into the body too much and hear more regular sound, then that means the clipper is affecting a lot more of the sound over time, therefore it'll be more audible. But if we hear really short bits, then that distortion is going to be far less audible. because it's only happening over a very short amount of time. So about 2 dB of gain reduction on the master was as much as I could get away with in this particular scenario. And if we compare listening to the whole project with limiting and then with clipping, so that's switching out a clipper for a limiter with the exact same amount of gain reduction on the kick, snare, break, shaker, and ARP, as well as the percussion group and the master. So using only limiters rather than using mostly clippers. So limiter version first. Then clip version. Definitely has a bit more bite and it's a bit punchier. Switching back to the limiter. Now we can see here, this is loss detection. The loss of the limited version is around minus 11.5. Minus 11 in some cases. When I switch back to the clip version, the exact same peak volume, we have more punch, and the lufs or loudness is actually increased almost a whole decibel. So that's a huge plus. Now that's everything I wanted to get through in this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Again, there's an article on my website where I discuss all the stuff I've mentioned today, as well as another video with diagrams displaying the differences between limiters and clippers. GMaudio Clipper really has changed the way that I make music, and definitely for the better. Just one more thing I'd mention, by using clipping on a track, you're potentially making it harder, and the tracks that don't use it are potentially softer. Now, if you're always using clipping on every track, and quite a lot of clipping, then there's going to be less contrast between the hard and soft sounds in a mix. And less contrast means a less exciting mix. As I mentioned earlier, in this particular project, I really like the edgy percussion to contrast against the ambience and space of this particular track. That's all for now. Happy music making. See you again soon.